Now, we were just talking about the report on the economy, and on Wednesday, the Chancellor will lay out an economic update, a mini-budget, if you like, in an attempt to try and shift focus to the much-hoped-for economic recovery. Now, to look ahead to what's coming up in that this week, we're joined by Labour's Shadow Chancellor, Dodds. Thank you very much for being on the programme. What are you hoping to see from the Chancellor?
Good morning. Well, we're really hoping that we will have a proper back-to-work budget next week. We really need to have that proper package put in place, not just so that we can help people if they become unemployed, but above all to prevent people becoming unemployed in the first place. Obviously, we've seen that one-size-fits-all approach being adopted by government to removing the economic support schemes. We can already see the impact of that on employment in the UK. So we're really saying to the Chancellor, look, abandon that one-size-fits-all approach. Let's have an approach which reflects the fact this is an economic crisis which is affecting sectors differently. Different sectors really need that strong support now. If we put it in place, then we won't see the kind of mass unemployment that's threatening our country currently.
I do wonder if a lot of what you're calling for, the government is already effectively doing. I mean, you're saying that you're hoping to see something focused around employment. We've been told just a few moments ago by Matt Hancock that it's going to be jobs, jobs, jobs that we're going to be hearing about on Wednesday. And talking about the one-size-fits-all approach, well, if you look at what Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, said just a week or so ago, he's called for direct fiscal support to those particular industries most affected. So it does feel as if the government is really looking at that anyway.
Well, Sophie, if they're looking at it, I'd be delighted because, unfortunately, we've been calling for many, many weeks, if not months, for government to change course around this. Quite frankly, this is not the stage to be looking at different forms of support while people are already losing their employment. You know, for a very, very long time, we've been saying to government that if they adopt that one-size-fits-all approach to removing support, which it doesn't sound like the Chancellor is looking like he's moving away from, if they adopt that approach, then we will see higher levels of unemployment. And the redundancies that we've seen over the last few days do seem to be linked to that timetable of the removal of support. So now is not the time to be looking into different measures, it's the time to be putting them into place. And frankly, our country is behind lots of others on this. You know, we will support the government in putting the right measures into place, but they really need to be far speedier at doing that.
We were talking as well to the House Secretary about more money for the NHS. Reports that he said he didn't recognise in the Observer, saying that NHS England has asked for an extra £10 billion to cover the cost of fighting coronavirus. Does the NHS need more money?
Well, I think the NHS really does need that sustainable funding settlement, and one of our main concerns is that, of course, we could well see, very sadly, an additional wave of this disease into the winter. Obviously, that could be associated also with flu cases, the other kinds of seasonal illnesses that we have building up to the winter. And it's really important that the NHS has that stability of funding so that it can plan towards that eventuality. You know, if we end up having to take measures at the last minute, that's obviously very expensive in the short term, and therefore we do need to see that sustainable funding. We've also said that government should be looking at, for example, expanding the flu vaccination programme to over 50 so that we can try and reduce that pressure on the NHS up to winter.
You know, it all sounds, very expensive, the idea that we need more support for people who may be losing their jobs, more money for the NHS, and of course the Chancellor will also be looking at ways to try and raise money for the Treasury. One thing that's been floated is scrapping the triple lock on pensions, which means, of course, that they have to rise by a certain amount each year. Would you support that?
Well, Sophie, I would just say about the beginning of your question, actually a lot of this is about where money is targeted, whether it's going in the right direction. We have actually seen a number of decisions taken by government which have been relatively expensive and which haven't delivered. You know, arguably that's been the case with some of the major contracts around the health support that we've seen, particularly around the app, for example. So we need to make sure that that money is spent correctly. We need to have that sectoral approach, which is about targeting as much as it's about the overall level of support. On the pensions triple lock, now, obviously, there is an issue there around how salaries are calculated. If we take into account, for example, people who've seen their hours reduced down to 80%, it wouldn't really be making sense to then count that as one of the three elements that bounce back to normal pay afterwards. But, this is a technical issue for government to sort out. It shouldn't affect whether the triple lock applies, and it seems to me that different things are getting mixed up in how government is talking about this. Whether they're committed to pensioners in the long term, I'm worried about whether they are or not, and the short-term technical issues about how you calculate the triple lock, which I'm sure government can deal with. I mean, it's got statisticians, it's got economists who can look into this and work out the figures for them.
Talking about some of those long-term issues, neither Labour nor the government want to see a return to austerity. That's what we've been told. Now, earlier this week, you said that as part of a new settlement, the government should think about introducing taxes on assets rather than income. So I'm just interested, what kind of assets are you talking about? Are you talking about savings? Are you talking about houses? What do you mean?
Well, Sophie, if I could, before I respond to the very last bit of your question, when we've heard that there won't be any return to the kinds of cuts that we've seen recently, actually local authorities are looking, many of them, at potentially having to shed a fifth of their staff within year if the current funding settlement goes ahead. So we shouldn't pretend that we're in very different circumstances. On the issue around taxation, look, I think it's really important. We've been through an enormous sacrifice as a nation in many cases, and it's very often been the lowest paid people who've been delivering for our country, the hospital porters, the delivery drivers. We shouldn't end up in a situation where, as government has suggested in some comments to the press, that we could see generalised tax rises across the whole population. I think that would be wrong. I don't think that low and middle income people should be targeted for tax rises. Instead, I think where there needs to be additional funds going into the system, they should be coming from those with the broadest shoulders. And we have seen an increase in income and wealth inequality over recent years. And I think there's strong public support for where there needs to be that additional contribution, that coming from those with the broadest shoulders.
So I'm just trying to talk about specifics, because it's one thing to say that those with the broadest shoulders should pay more. I'm sure most people would agree with that. What do you mean when you say that you think that we should be looking at taxes on assets? Are you talking about taxes on savings? Are you talking about taxes on housing? What are you talking about?
Well, Sophie, as I said before, this is in the context of that debate where government seems to have intimated that it would be seeking to be potentially raising taxes on all of the population. Now, I don't think that's right. I think it should be targeted. Now, I'm not going to say to you to spell out exactly how that should work. I think that's down to government right now. If Labour was in government...
You're a new Shadow Chancellor. It feels to me like this is an important debate to have. And frankly, I don't really know what you're talking... Like, you talk about taxing assets, but what do you mean? Would a Labour government consider taxing people's savings or people's houses?
Well, as I said, that debate would only arise at the stage if we needed additional contributions into the system. I'm hoping that we won't see the continued reduction in the size of our economy. Actually, it's best if we can grow our way out of this crisis. But if there needs to be an increased contribution, then it should be coming from those with the broadest shoulders. And when we look at what's happened to the tax system, this applies across a whole variety of elements of taxation of the very best of people. That has gone down. I think you find very few economists who would disagree with that. And yet, support for the lowest income people and the middle income people has been reduced at the same time. That's not a fair settlement. And government should be taking a different approach rather than briefing out suggesting that, for example, income tax could be increased for everyone in the population. They should be looking at those with the broadest shoulders making more of a contribution. I think that's really important.
I think I'm struggling to find out really what you meant by the assets. But, it's the first time that I've interviewed, so I'm quite keen to kind of get a bit of a sense about your sort of vision, I guess, the kind of Chancellor that you would like to be if you were in that job. Now, I interviewed your predecessor, John McDonnell, last year. He said that he'd like to see a socialist society. I want to see a transformed economy, so not capitalism as it now operates. So do you also want to redefine capitalism? Are you a socialist?
Well, what I want to see is a much fairer society. I want to see a society where we don't have, for example, hospital porters living... in my city, in Oxford, we've got hospital porters who are living in single rooms in houses in multiple occupation, who, if they have their bike stolen, for example, I've had one of them in tears in front of me when I knocked on his door. That to me, we need to see a change away from that kind of a society. We've seen how the lack of financial resilience of so many people in the UK has been enormously problematic during this crisis. We entered it with a quarter of UK families not even having £100 in savings. We need a change to that. Now, some people would call that socialism, some people would call it fairness. What's most important to me is that we actually get that change, that we don't ever enter a crisis again with so many families in our country struggling.
Now, moving on, one of the biggest challenges, it feels to me, facing us as we start the recovery from coronavirus is convincing people that it's safe to send their children back to school. I went to a school, for example, in West Sussex just 2 weeks ago, where he said that it was a real challenge, actually, making pupils and their parents feel that it was safe to return to the classroom. And Labour has been a bit criticised for not saying that children should be back in the classroom sooner. Now, in May, you suggested that you wouldn't be happy to send your child back to school without more evidence that by doing so, coronavirus wouldn't be spread. I would be more than happy to send my own child back to school if I knew that by doing so, I would not be potentially harming others. We don't have that evidence. We don't have that evidence in front of us now. Was that a helpful comment for a Shadow Chancellor to make?
Well, actually, it's a very, very interesting case, this, because very, very quickly, and maybe it's something slightly more to do with women politicians, I don't know, very, very quickly people suggested that as a result of that I wouldn't be sending my child back to school. You just quoted my words, and I didn't actually say that at all. I said that I believed that parents needed more evidence. I said that we needed to have a proper strategy around this, one that involved teachers and parents working together with government. That immediately got turned into something personal about me, as it was. My son wasn't even in the age group that would have been going back at that time. He has now gone back to school, is one of many children who have. But you'll be aware that there are many, many other families who don't yet have confidence in the system. We've got to have a grip on this from government. Time and time again, we urged government to work with teachers, to work with local authorities, to make sure that we had that process towards reopening. They've suggested that they will be starting to have that process now. Now, it's very, very late, it's far too slow, but at least it's being put in place now in advance of September. And we're really saying to them, look, you've got to concentrate on this, because having so many children who are not in school, obviously it's bad for those children, but of course I'm aware of the fact that it means so many parents are not able to go back to work if they're able to, because they just don't have that childcare there, they don't have their children being in school. So it's something government critically needs to get a grip on.
OK, now we are running out of time, but I'm keen just to ask one final question on the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei. Reports in the papers this morning, the government is going to start beginning a process of removing its involvement from the 5G network. Is that the right decision?
Well, we've been saying that government needs to have a proper strategy around this for many, many months. We were told that there was going to be an approach to try and work out a more diversified approach to our telecoms infrastructure, to try and make sure that there wouldn't be a reliance on some of the very, very major players where there might be these security issues. Now, that strategy was not forthcoming. Now there seems to have been some suggestions today, and they seem to be kind of leaks. I'm not sure of whether they've been verified or not, that there might be a different approach being taken. We really don't want to have policy being made in this kind of lurching manner. We need to have a long-term strategy. Our communications infrastructure is really important for this country. We've obviously seen that particularly over the last few weeks. So government needs to be looking at this in a much longer-term framework, rather than seemingly being driven by, as I say, these kind of lurches in policy.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Much appreciated.